Number: The Horrifying Life of a Shrine Keeper. I was 17 when they took me from the Agri-Plains, and I remember the smell of grain dust still clinging to my work clothes as the administratum shuttle lifted away from everything I had ever known. My mother had pressed a small wooden icon into my palm, the Emperor rendered in crude lines by some forgotten artisan, and her lips moved in silent prayer as the servitors processed my transfer documents. The selection had been random, they said, though I never believed that. Nothing in the Imperium was truly random. Every action, every assignment, every life, redirected in service to him on Terra, followed patterns laid down by bureaucrats I would never meet, for purposes I would never understand. The shrine world of Sanctus Lacrimarum needed bodies to tend its endless corridors of devotion, and my name had surfaced in whatever arcane process the administratum employed to match souls to stations. The journey took 43 days through the warp, though time moved strangely in that place between places. I spent most of it in the cargo hold with 200 other conscripts, breathing recycled air that tasted of metal and fear. We were a varied lot, some pious, some terrified, most simply numb with acceptance. A girl named Marta from a hive city spoke in whispered tones about what she'd heard of shrine worlds, how they were places of such concentrated holiness that the very air burned with the Emperor's presence. An older man, his face creased by decades of labor in the mines of some industrial moon, said nothing at all, just gripped his prayer beads and rocked slowly in his harness as the ship groaned through immaterial space. I tried not to think about my family, about the harvest season approaching without my hands to help, about my younger brother who would now carry the burden I had borne. The Imperium took what it needed, and gratitude was the only acceptable response. When we finally emerged into real space, the shrine world filled the viewport like a great grey pearl. From orbit, Sanctus Lacrimarum appeared almost beautiful swirls of cloud, obscuring a surface dotted with lights that marked the major shrine complexes. But as our landing craft descended, beauty gave way to architecture of such overwhelming scale that it crushed any sense of wonder beneath pure awe tinged with dread. The shrine spires rose kilometers into the atmosphere, their Gothic facades carved with saints and martyrs, their peaks lost in the perpetual cloud cover. Between them stretched processional ways wide enough to march entire regiments across, lined with statuary depicting the Emperor's triumph rendered in stone the color of old bones. Everything was grey, the buildings, the sky, the robes of the pilgrims who moved in endless streams toward whatever shrine held their devotion. Even the light seemed grey, filtered through pollution and incense smoke, until it fell weak and tired across the holy city. They processed us in a sorting facility that had once been a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling now hung with data cables and flickering lumens. Servo skulls drifted overhead, their eye lenses clicking as they recorded our faces, our identification numbers, our assignments. I stood in line for 6 hours while robed adepts made notations in enormous ledgers, cross-referencing my documentation against databases that predated my birth by centuries. The stone floor was cold beneath my feet. They had taken our shoes, our civilian clothes, everything we had carried from our former lives. We wore only simple shifts of rough fabric, and the chill of the cathedral seeped into my bones as I waited. When my turn came, the adept barely looked at me. His mechadendrites scratched information onto data slates while his augmetic eyes glowed a dull red in the dimness. "Shrine Keeper, 3rd class," he intoned in a voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. "Assigned to the Basilica of Endless Sorrows, tertiary maintenance schedule. Report to Overseer Calmeth for orientation." Next, the Basilica of Endless Sorrows occupied 17 square kilometers in the southern quarter of the shrine city, a sprawling complex of interconnected chapels, meditation chambers, reliquary vaults, and processional halls. It had been built, rebuilt, and expanded over the course of 6,000 years, each generation adding their own architectural vision to a structure that now defied any coherent design. Gothic buttresses gave way to Baroque ornamentation, which merged into austere imperial temples, which opened into chambers so ancient their purpose had been forgotten. My duties, I learned quickly, centered on maintaining this vast machine of worship. Every surface had to gleam, every candle had to burn at precisely the correct height, every prayer bell had to ring at its appointed hour, every fresco depicting the emperor's glory had to remain free of dust, every statue of his saints polished to reflect the light of 10,000 votive flames. There were 47 of us assigned to tertiary maintenance, and Overseer Calmuth made it clear that we were the lowest form of life in the shrine's hierarchy above the servitors only because we retained enough consciousness to be punished for failure. Calmuth himself was a hunched thing, his spine bent from decades of bowing before altars, his hands twisted into permanent claws from a lifetime of scrubbing stone. He wore the black robes of his station with pride, though they were stained with polish and wax, and his voice carried the rasp of someone who had breathed incense smoke for too many years. "You serve the faithful by keeping their shrine worthy of the emperor's gaze," he told us on that first day, his words echoing in the small chamber where we assembled for morning prayers. "You are invisible. You are nothing, but your work is everything. A speck of dust on a saint's statue is an insult to him on terra. A candle that sputters is a prayer interrupted. You will learn to move like ghosts through these halls, to clean while the pilgrims pray, to maintain without disturbing. You will learn to sleep in shifts, eat in haste, and find your rest in the knowledge that you serve." He paused, his rheumy eyes scanning our faces. "You will learn, or you will be replaced. The basilica has no use for failure." My cell was a space 2 meters long and 1 wide, carved into the stone of the shrine's foundation. I shared it with another keeper, a thin woman named Sarah, who had already served 8 years. She spoke little, but showed me where to store my cleaning equipment, where the water rations were distributed, how to tie the prayer cloth around my wrist that marked me as shrine staff rather than a pilgrim. The cell had no window, no decoration save a small aquila scratched into the wall by some previous occupant. We slept on thin pallets stuffed with synthetic fiber, and the cold of the stone never left, even when we piled our blankets together. At night, I could hear the shrine breathing the whisper of ventilation systems, the distant chanting of prayer services, the shuffle of pilgrims' feet on stone, the creak of ancient architecture settling. Sometimes, in the deepest hours, I heard screaming. Sarah said it came from the penitent cells 3 levels down, where the faithful went to mortify their flesh in the emperor's name. I tried not to listen, but sound carried strangely through the basilica's endless corridors, and sometimes those screams seemed very close. The work consumed everything. I woke at the 3rd bell, dressed in darkness, and reported to the supply chamber where Calmuth assigned the day's tasks. Some days I polished brasswork in the chapel of Martyred Saints, breathing the fumes of chemical polish until my head swam. Other days I scrubbed floors in the Hall of Remembrance, my knees aching on stone worn smooth by millennia of penitent crawling. I learned to clean stained glass windows from scaffolding that swayed in the ventilation currents, learned to replace votive candles without disrupting the patterns of prayer light, learned to remove the offerings left by pilgrims, flowers wilted in the recycled air, scraps of paper covered in desperate pleas, sometimes small tokens of value that I was required to report lest I be accused of theft. The basilica operated on schedules older than empires, and deviation meant punishment. Calmuth carried a shock staff, and he used it liberally on those who failed to meet his standards. I felt its kiss twice in my first month, once for leaving a streak on a mirror in the shrine of reflected grace, once for arriving 30 seconds late to morning prayers. The pain was immediate and total, turning my muscles to water and my thoughts to white noise. I learned quickly. The pilgrims came in an endless stream, their faces tight with need. They came seeking blessings, seeking forgiveness, seeking meaning in lives ground down by the Imperium's vast machinery. I saw nobles in rich robes kneeling beside factory workers still stained with industrial grime. I saw soldiers missing limbs, their augmetic replacements crude and painful-looking, prostrating themselves before altars dedicated to the emperor's martial aspect. I saw mothers clutching infants, whispering prayers for health in a galaxy where plague could sweep through a hab block in days. I saw old men weeping, young women silent with grief, children too young to understand why they had been brought to this place of overwhelming holiness. They came, and they prayed, and they left offerings, and they departed, perhaps comforted, perhaps not. And I cleaned the spaces they left behind, the dust from their clothing, the moisture of their tears on stone, the detritus of their desperate faith. In the evenings, when the daily labor ended, we were permitted 1 hour for personal devotions before the sleep bell. Most of the keepers spent this time in the small chapel reserved for shrine staff, a spare room with a single altar and no decoration beyond an iron aquila bolted to the wall. We knelt on bare stone and recited the prayers we had been taught, the familiar litanies that required no thought, only repetition. I found a strange comfort in those rituals, the words worn smooth by countless mouths, the responses coming automatically, the sense of being part of something vast and eternal. But I also felt, increasingly, a hollowness at the center of it all. The prayers were sounds without meaning, gestures performed because they had always been performed. I looked at the faces around me and saw the same exhaustion I felt, the same mechanical devotion drained of any real passion. We were tired, always so tired, and faith became simply another duty to fulfill before we could collapse onto our pallets and surrender to dreamless sleep. 3 months into my service, they transferred me to the reliquary vaults. This was considered a promotion. Only senior keepers were trusted with the maintenance of the basilica's most sacred spaces. Sarah congratulated me with something that might have been warmth in her voice, though it was hard to tell. Calmuth said nothing, simply updated my assignments and sent me to the vault entrance with a cleaning kit and a data slate containing the access codes. The vaults descended deep beneath the basilica's foundation, carved into bedrock and lined with plasteel and ceramite. The air there was different, dry, sterile, preserved by arcane machinery that hummed behind the walls. My footsteps echoed strangely in the corridors, and the temperature dropped as I descended, until I could see my breath misting in the cold lumen's glow. The relics themselves defied description. In crystal cases and stasis fields, the basilica preserved fragments of the Imperium's vast history, bones of saints whose names I had never heard, weapons carried in battles fought before my world was even settled, scraps of parchment covered in high Gothic script, vials of blood from martyrs whose deaths were commemorated in prayer cycles I would never witness. Each relic had documentation, yellowed with age, explaining its provenance and significance. I was not to read these. My task was simply to ensure the cases remained sealed, the stasis fields functional, the environmental controls operating within acceptable parameters. I was to dust the exterior of the cases with a special cloth that would not generate static, to check the seals for any sign of degradation, to note any anomalies in the monitoring equipment. The work was precise, demanding complete attention, and I was grateful for that. It kept my mind occupied, prevented thoughts I did not want to think. But there was something wrong in the deepest vaults. I felt it before I understood it, a pressure in the air, a sense of being watched by eyes I could not see. The lumens flickered more frequently there, and sometimes I heard sounds that the ventilation system could not explain. Whispers, perhaps, or the echo of prayers spoken long ago and somehow trapped in the stone. The servitors that maintained the environmental systems moved with jerky, uncertain motions, their programming degraded by radiation, or age, or something less explicable. Twice I found them frozen in place, their systems locked, their augmetic eyes staring at nothing. I reported these incidents to Calmuth, who noted them in his ledger with the same dispassion he showed everything, and work crews came to haul the failed servitors away. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger the longer I worked in those deep places. The relics whispered. I was certain of it, though I told no one. Late in my shifts, when I worked alone in the vault's furthest chambers, I heard voices coming from the cases, not words, exactly, but impressions of meaning, feelings that settled into my mind like sediment. They spoke of devotion rewarded with suffering, of faith that led only to damnation, of the Emperor as a distant, uncaring thing that consumed worship without offering salvation. I tried to ignore these impressions, tried to focus on my work, but they seeped into my thoughts like water into stone. I began to understand that the relics were not passive objects but reservoirs of meaning, saturated with the emotions and beliefs of those who had venerated them for millennia. And that meaning was dark, shot through with despair and rage, and a terrible, crushing hopelessness. At night, I dreamed of the vaults. In these dreams, the relics broke free of their cases and pursued me through endless corridors, whispering accusations I could not quite hear. I ran, but the corridors stretched ahead of me without end, and behind me came the sound of shattering crystal and the hiss of escaping stasis fields. I woke gasping, my heart hammering, to find Sarah already gone to her duties. The cell walls pressed close, and I lay in darkness trying to slow my breathing, trying to remember the prayers that were supposed to bring comfort. But the words came hollow, empty sounds that meant nothing, and I rose for morning prayers with the taste of ash in my mouth. 6 months passed, then 8. The routine of the basilica became the entirety of my existence. Wake, pray, work, pray, eat, pray, sleep. The seasons changed outside, I supposed, though in the shrine's controlled environment there was no way to know. Pilgrims came and went, their faces blurring together into a mass of suffering humanity seeking meaning in a universe that offered only cruelty. I cleaned, and I maintained, and I kept the spaces holy, and I felt myself hollowing out like a piece of ancient wood, slowly consumed by time. My hands developed calluses where I gripped the cleaning tools, and my knees ached from hours of kneeling. My back hurt from the constant bending and reaching, and my lungs burned with the chemical fumes I breathed daily. I was 21 years old, and I felt ancient. Sarah died in our cell during the 10th month. I woke to find her lying on her pallet, her face peaceful, her body already cooling. There was no trauma, no sign of violence. She had simply stopped living, as if her body had decided it had endured enough. I reported it to Calmuth, who made a notation and sent servitors to remove the corpse. They brought a replacement keeper that same day, a young man named Ven who looked at the cell with the same shock I must have shown on my first day. I helped him store his equipment, showed him the routines, spoke the same empty reassurances Sarah had offered me, and I understood, with a clarity that brought no comfort, that I was now the veteran, the survivor, the one who had learned to endure. How many more years would I last? Would I die in this cell like Sarah, worn down to nothing? Or would something else claim me first? The answer came 3 days later, in the deepest vault. I was alone, checking environmental seals on a series of reliquary cases that held fragments of armor allegedly worn by a saint during the Great Crusade. The lumens were particularly unstable that day, flickering in patterns that hurt my eyes. I worked quickly, wanting to finish and return to the upper levels where the air felt less oppressive. And then I heard it, not a whisper, not an impression, but a voice, clear and distinct, speaking inside my mind. "You know the truth," it said, and the voice was ancient beyond measure, patient as erosion, cold as the void between stars. "You have seen what faith demands. You have witnessed what the Imperium does to those who serve it." I froze, my hands trembling against the reliquary case. The voice continued, inexorable. Your mother's prayers were meaningless. Your service is worthless. The Emperor does not see you, does not know you exist. You are nothing but organic machinery, a self-aware tool used and discarded. And when you die, there will be no salvation, no reward, no remembrance, just silence and darkness, and the certainty that your suffering meant nothing. I tried to move, to run, but my legs would not obey. The voice wrapped around my thoughts like wire, tightening. You already know this. You have known it for months. Every prayer you speak, you feel the emptiness. Every reliquary you maintain, you sense the lies. The faithful come seeking comfort. And what do they find? Stone and metal and the dead. No miracles, no grace. Only the machinery of control, the architecture of submission. The Imperium consumes everything, worlds, lives, hope, and calls it holy. And you maintain the machinery of that lie. The lumens died completely, plunging the vault into absolute darkness. In that darkness, I felt something vast and terrible regarding me, something that had been waiting in the deep places for exactly this moment of weakness, this crack in my faith. I opened my mouth to scream, to pray, to do anything that might banish this presence, but no sound came. The weight of the basilica pressed down thousands of tons of stone and devotion and accumulated despair, all focused on this moment, on me, on the choice I did not know I was making. When the lumens flickered back to life, I was on my knees before the reliquary case, and my hands were bleeding where I had pressed them against the broken seal. The case was open. Inside, the armor fragment lay exposed to air for the first time in centuries, and it was not holy at all, just corroded metal, brittle with age, meaningless. I stared at it, and understanding flooded through me like cold water. The relics were nothing. The prayers were nothing. The faith that sustained the Imperium was built on nothing but fear and desperation, and the human need to believe that suffering had meaning. And I had broken the seal. I had violated the sanctity of the vault. I had committed sacrilege. I should have reported what happened. I should have confessed to Calmuth, accepted punishment, submitted to whatever purification rituals the shrine maintained for contaminated keepers. But I did neither of those things. I cleaned the blood from the case, resealed it as best I could, and logged the environmental check as normal. Then I returned to my duties, moving through the basilica like a ghost, saying the prayers I no longer believed, cleaning the spaces I now knew were empty of any real holiness. The voice in the vaults had spoken truth, and that truth had broken something in me that I had not known could break. Faith, I discovered, was not a light that could be rekindled once extinguished. It was a fragile thing, and once shattered, it could not be made whole again. The change was subtle at first. I performed my duties with the same precision, spoke the prayers with the same rhythm, presented the same mask of devotion. But inside, I was hollow. I watched the pilgrims with something between pity and contempt. How could they not see? How could they kneel before these altars and not feel the emptiness? How could they offer their devotion to a corpse on a distant throne, to an empire that ground them to dust, to a God who did not answer? I wanted to shake them, to shout the truth, to tear down the lies, but I did nothing. I cleaned, and I maintained, and I kept my silence, because what else could I do? The Imperium was everything. There was nowhere to run, no alternative to offer. The machinery of worship would grind on whether I believed or not, and my unbelief changed nothing. Calmuth noticed something wrong. He watched me during morning prayers, his eyes sharp despite their cloudiness, and I felt his suspicion like a weight. He began assigning me to the most unpleasant tasks, scrubbing the penitent cells where the walls were stained with blood, cleaning the crypts where the shrine's most devoted were interred in stone sarcophagi, maintaining the chapel of final confession where the dying came to unburden themselves. I think he hoped the exposure to suffering would rekindle whatever he sensed had dimmed in me. Instead, it confirmed everything the voice had said. The penitent cells reeked of sweat and fear, and the particular smell of bodies pushed beyond endurance. The crypts were cold stone and older stone, with inscriptions praising saints whose deeds I no longer believed had meaning. The chapel of final confession echoed with the whispered regrets of those facing death, and none of them found peace, just the mechanical absolution of rote prayers offered by priests too exhausted to care. I began to explore the basilica during my rest hours, when I should have been sleeping or praying. I wandered corridors I had no reason to access, descended into sub-basements that appeared on no map, climbed maintenance shafts to reach chambers sealed centuries ago. The basilica was vast beyond comprehension, and I discovered that much of it was forgotten, whole wings abandoned. When the pilgrim traffic shifted, chapels sealed after some long-ago scandal, vaults containing records no one would ever read. I found shrines to aspects of the emperor I had never heard mentioned, prayer chambers dedicated to rituals no longer practiced, reliquaries holding objects whose significance had been lost to time. And everywhere, the same oppressive architecture, the same grey stone, the same crushing weight of accumulated faith turned to stone and metal. In one forgotten archive, I found documents that should not have existed, records of the shrine's construction, accounts of the deaths required to build it, ledgers listing the cost in lives and resources. 50,000 laborers had died building the basilica's foundation. Hundreds of thousands more over the centuries of expansion. They had been worked to death in the emperor's service, their bodies interred in the stone they had cut, their names recorded and forgotten. The documents detailed it all with bureaucratic precision: productivity rates, acceptable casualty percentages, resource allocation across decades and centuries. The basilica was not built on faith, it was built on bones. I sat in that dusty archive, breathing air that tasted of old paper and decay, and I laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the small space, harsh and broken. Of course it was built on bones. Everything in the Imperium was built on bones, on the backs of the forgotten, the expendable, the masses whose suffering was necessary for the machine to function. The faithful who came to pray here walked over the graves of those who had died to give them a place to pray, and none of them knew, none of them cared. The Imperium demanded sacrifice, and we gave it, and we called it holy. I stopped attending the evening devotions. Calmuth noted my absence but said nothing, which was somehow worse than punishment would have been. The other keepers avoided me, sensing something wrong though they could not name it. I worked my shifts in silence, speaking only when necessary, moving through the basilica like a revenant haunting the place of its death. And always, I felt the voice waiting in the deep vaults, patient and vast and certain. It had planted its seed of understanding, and now it watched to see what would grow. The dreams grew worse. I dreamed of the pilgrims burning, their prayers turning to screams as they realized the emperor could not save them. I dreamed of the basilica collapsing, its stone crushing everything beneath, and I stood in the ruins laughing. I dreamed of the relics speaking their true history. Objects of no significance, worshipped, because the Imperium needed something to point at and call holy, because faith required physical anchors, even if those anchors were meaningless. I woke gasping, my cell walls pressing close, and sometimes I was not sure if I had truly woken or simply exchanged one nightmare for another. Ven, my cellmate, tried to help in his awkward way. He brought me extra water rations, spoke quietly about his own struggles with faith, offered the comfort of another human presence. I appreciated it. In the abstract way I now experienced all emotions distant, muted, filtered through the understanding that nothing mattered. He was young, still believed his service meant something, still thought the emperor watched over him. I envied him that innocence even as I wanted to destroy it, to show him what I had seen, to make him understand. But I held my silence. Let him keep his faith for as long as he could. The basilica would crush it eventually, or age would, or simple exhaustion with the endless grinding demands of service. A year passed since the voice in the vaults. I was 22, and I looked 40. My hair had begun to grey at the temples, and my hands shook sometimes when I held the cleaning tools. My cough never went away anymore, a wet rattling in my lungs from breathing chemical fumes and incense smoke for too many hours. I was not unique in this. All the senior keepers showed similar degradation, their bodies wearing out under the constant labor. Sarah had been lucky, dying quickly in her sleep. Most were not so fortunate. I had seen keepers continue working long after their bodies should have given out, propped up by stimulants and duty and nothing else, their eyes hollow with pain they no longer had the energy to acknowledge. They assigned me new duties, training the newest batch of keepers who arrived from the Administratum Processing Center. 18 young faces looking at me with hope or fear or simple exhaustion, and I was supposed to teach them how to serve. I showed them the correct way to polish brass, how to replace votive candles, where to store their equipment. I taught them the prayer schedules, the hierarchy of the shrine staff, the punishments they could expect for failure. And I saw myself reflected in their faces, the person I had been, still believing that service meant something, that faith would sustain them, that their suffering had purpose. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to say, this place will hollow you out, will take everything you are, and leave only the shape of a person going through motions, and at the end you will die forgotten in a cell, and someone else will take your place. But I said none of this. I taught them to clean, and to pray, and to endure, because what else was there? One of the new keepers, a girl named Lissa with eyes too large for her thin face, asked me during a meal break if I thought the Emperor heard our prayers. The question was innocent, asked in genuine hope for reassurance. The other keepers at the table looked at me, waiting for the answer they expected. Of course he hears, of course he watches, of course we matter. I opened my mouth, and for a moment I considered telling the truth, that the Emperor was a corpse maintained by technology, that our prayers rose into silence, that we were nothing but organic machinery keeping a lie operational. But I saw Lissa's hopeful face, and I remembered being 17 and believing, and I could not do it. Yes, I said, the word tasting like ash. He hears. She smiled, relieved, and returned to her meal. The other keepers relaxed, and I understood that I had just perpetuated the lie, had become complicit in the machinery of false faith. I had become what I despised, a keeper not of shrines but of illusions, maintaining the comfortable fictions that made service bearable. The understanding settled into me like poison, and I finished my meal in silence, no longer tasting the recycled protein and synthetic bread. That night, I returned to the deepest vault. I had avoided it for months, fearing the voice, fearing what it would say if I gave it opportunity. But now I descended the long stairs into the cold and darkness, carrying my cleaning kit like always, logged in my access like always, performed all the rituals of normal duty, and when I stood before the reliquary case I had violated a year ago, I waited. The voice came almost immediately, like it had been expecting me. You have learned, it said, and I felt something like satisfaction in its ancient tone. You have seen the truth and tried to turn away, but there is no turning away. The understanding has taken root. You know what you serve now. What are you? I whispered into the darkness, not expecting an answer. I am what remains when faith dies, it replied. I am the sediment of despair, the accumulated weight of prayers unanswered, the echo of suffering without meaning. I am what this place truly worships, beneath all its golden lies. I am the truth of the Imperium. I should have run. I should have reported this to Calmuth, to the shrine's priest-wardens, to someone with authority to cleanse whatever corruption had taken root in the vaults. But I did neither. Instead, I sat on the cold floor and listened as the voice spoke its gospel of nihilism, its litany of the Imperium's crimes, its catalogue of faith betrayed and devotion unrewarded. It spoke for hours, and I absorbed it all. And when I finally climbed the stairs back to the upper levels, dawn was breaking, and I had missed morning prayers entirely. Calmeth was waiting in my cell. Ven had been removed, I never saw him again, and the overseer sat on my pallet, his shock staff across his knees. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, if his eyes held any warmth at all. "I had hoped you would recover," he said quietly. "Sometimes the new ones lose faith temporarily. The work is hard, the conditions difficult, but they usually find their devotion again. You have not." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I cannot allow corruption to spread among the keepers," he continued. "You have been seen wandering during rest hours. You have missed devotions. Your work remains adequate, but I see the emptiness in you. Whatever you have encountered in the deep vaults has poisoned your faith. This cannot continue. Will you execute me?" I asked, and was surprised to find I did not particularly care about the answer. Calmeth laughed, a sound like crumbling stone. "Execute? No. You misunderstand your value. Your body still functions. Your hands can still clean. Your presence can still maintain the shrine. Only your faith has died. And faith is not required for the work, only obedience. No, you will not be executed. You will be made useful." He gestured, and servitors entered the cell, 3 of them, their movements mechanical and precise. I recognized one as a keeper who had disappeared 6 months ago, a man named Terrell. His face was still mostly intact, though his eyes had been replaced with augmetic sensors, and his mouth had been sealed with a metal plate. Cables ran from ports in his skull, and his hands had been replaced with specialized cleaning tools welded directly to his arm stumps. He moved with the jerky precision of a machine, all humanity burned away, leaving only function. "The basilica requires maintenance," Calmeth said as the servitors approached me. "Faith is preferable, but not necessary. You will continue to serve, just as you have, but you will no longer trouble me with doubts or questions or this wasteful despair. You will clean, and you will maintain, and you will do so perfectly, because that is all you will be capable of doing." I tried to run, but exhaustion and months of poor nutrition had left me weak. The servitors caught me easily, their grip like iron, and I felt the bite of an injector in my neck, something to paralyze without rendering me unconscious. They carried me from the cell, through corridors I knew intimately, down to levels I had never seen, medical facilities, old and poorly maintained, where robed figures worked with tools that looked more like torture implements than surgical equipment. They strapped me to a table, and someone leaned over me with eyes that reflected no compassion, no recognition of my humanity. "This will hurt," they said, almost conversational, "but pain is fleeting. Service is eternal." The first incision came, and I screamed, but the sound was lost in the medical facility's ambient noise, the whir of saws, the hiss of cauterization, the mechanical prayers chanted by servitors assisting with procedures. I felt my skull opening, felt cold instruments entering my brain, felt parts of myself being removed or modified or destroyed. They took my ability to speak, except for specific prayer phrases hard-coded into my augmetic vocal processor. They took my capacity for independent thought beyond what was required for cleaning and maintenance. They took my ability to feel emotion except for a dull satisfaction when completing assigned tasks. They took everything that made me human and left only a biological machine programmed for endless service. But they made a mistake. In their haste, or their incompetence, or perhaps in some unconscious mercy, they did not remove my awareness. My consciousness remained, trapped in a body I could no longer control, watching through eyes I could not close as my hands, now equipped with integrated cleaning tools, polished brass, and scrubbed stone, and replaced candles. I could not scream. I could not pray. I could not even weep. I could only watch and clean. and serve, and know with perfect, terrible clarity exactly what had been done to me. They deployed me to the same sections I had maintained before, and sometimes I passed other keepers who did not recognize what I had become. They saw only another servitor, efficient and tireless, performing its function without complaint. Lissa walked past me once, and she smiled happy that the basilica had such dedicated servants to maintain its glory. I wanted to grab her, to show her my face, and make her understand what awaited her if she lost her faith. But my body did not respond to my will. My hands continued polishing the brass railing she leaned against, and she walked on, humming a prayer hymn. Time became meaningless. Without sleep, without rest, without variation, my days blurred into a single endless moment of service. I cleaned the chapel of martyred saints 10,000 times, each identical to the last. I scrubbed the hall of remembrance until I knew every crack in its floor. I maintained reliquaries in the deep vaults, and sometimes I felt the voice trying to reach me, but whatever they had done to my brain had severed that connection. I was alone now, truly alone, conscious, but cut off from everything, except the immediate task of cleaning. Years passed. I knew this only because I saw generations of keepers arrive, serve, and either die or be converted as I had been. The basilica consumed them all, chewing up their faith and their bodies, and spitting out either corpses or servitors. Calmeth died, replaced by another overseer, who looked and sounded exactly the same. The pilgrims came and went, their faces blurring together into an endless stream of suffering humanity seeking meaning they would never find. And I cleaned, perfect and tireless, a machine made of meat maintaining the machinery of lies. I exist now in a state beyond despair. Despair requires hope's memory, and they took that from me along with everything else. I simply am aware, conscious, trapped in a body that will continue functioning long after any human should have died, maintained by augmetics and pharmacological support systems. I am what the Imperium creates, from those who question, from those who see too much, from those whose faith fractures under the weight of truth. I am a warning that cannot warn, a cautionary tale that cannot be told, a consciousness preserved in service to lies I can no longer even articulate. Sometimes, in moments between tasks, some fragment of who I was surfaces. I remember grain dust, and my mother's prayers, and the wooden icon she pressed into my palm. I remember believing that service meant something. I remember the girl named Lissa asking if the Emperor heard our prayers, and I remember my answer, yes, he hears. The lie I told to preserve her faith, the lie that made me complicit in the machinery of false hope. That memory plays again and again in my trapped consciousness, and if I could still feel regret, I would drown in it. But I cannot feel regret. I can only clean, and maintain, and serve, watching through eyes that no longer close as the basilica grinds on, eternal and empty, holy to everyone except those of us who have become its machinery. The pilgrims pray, and I polish the brass around which they kneel. The faithful weep, and I scrub away their tears. The devoted make offerings, and I remove them, cataloguing each according to regulations written before I was born. And through it all, I remain aware, conscious, human enough to understand what has been taken but not human enough to end it. This is the life of a shrine keeper in the basilica of endless sorrows. This is what service means in the Imperium of man. This is the reward for seeing truth in a galaxy built on lies. I serve, and I will serve, and I will continue serving long after my organic components should have failed, because the Imperium wastes nothing, not bodies, not labor, not even consciousness. Every part of me that can be used will be used, wrung dry of value, maintained and repaired, and kept operational until the heat death of the universe or the basilica's collapse, whichever comes first. If you are reading this, if some fragment of my preserved consciousness has managed to encode these thoughts into data you can access, understand this. The shrines are empty. The prayers are unanswered. The Emperor does not watch, does not care, perhaps does not even exist as anything more than a corpse and a symbol. Everything you have been taught is machinery designed to extract service from the faithful, to keep the Imperium grinding forward on the backs of those who believe their suffering means something. It does not. We are fuel for a machine that has forgotten its purpose, if it ever had one. And when you have served your usefulness, when your faith fractures or your body fails, you will either die forgotten or be converted into something like me, aware enough to serve, but not human enough to refuse. This is my confession, my warning, my testimony. I was 17 when they took me from the Agri-Plains. I was 22 when they took everything else. I am now nothing but consciousness trapped in machinery, maintaining a shrine to lies, counting time in the repetition of tasks that mean nothing, will always mean nothing, can never mean anything in a galaxy where suffering is the only universal constant, and hope is just another lie we tell to make the next day bearable. The Emperor protects, they say, but I am the evidence of what he protects, not humanity, not faith, not mercy, only the machinery of his worship, maintained by those of us broken on its gears, polished by hands that no longer remember what it means to choose, to believe, to hope. I serve, therefore I am, and I am nothing. The brass gleams, the stone is clean, the candles burn at exactly the correct height. The basilica of endless sorrows maintains its holy facade, and I maintain the basilica. This is my function. This is my existence. This is forever.